Lesson, we're going to talk about sermon illustrations. This is one of my favorite parts of preparing a sermon. Illustrations, good illustrations, can accomplish a number of things within the flow of your sermon. Of course, they can illuminate the meaning of the text. If there's a concept that is unclear, a really good illustration can help clarify by way of metaphor or analogy, especially abstract concepts like love or grace, for example. A concept like grace, just to explain what it means, it might not really be clear in people's minds. But if you tell a story about a time that somebody showed you grace when you deserved punishment, that becomes concrete in their mind and it helps to illuminate the meaning of a word from the text. So illustrations can illuminate the text meaning. They can validate the text's relevance or truthfulness. So if you are describing something related to generosity and sort of the blessings of generosity, how your walk with the Lord will grow and improve as you practice generosity, you might share a story from your own life, how you drew closer to the Lord and learned to trust Him as you learned to be generous. It puts it again in concrete terms. It can validate that what you're saying is actually true. We'll see that especially illustrations like statistics and news stories are really good for validating purposes. Good illustrations can also just kind of create some breathing space and a little bit of engagement with the congregation. If all you do for 35 minutes or 40 minutes is just exposition of the text, especially if you're in a relatively difficult to understand text or a long text, and all you do is exposit the text with no illustrations, it's hard for people's brains to focus that long just on exposition and logical explanation. So what a story does is it gives people the opportunity to relate to what you're saying and also to engage with it well, so that they kind of get like almost a little mental break. We're gonna step out of the exposition for a minute and we're gonna hear a story. And I want you just to try sometime in the middle of a message, tell a story, and as you're telling the story, watch the reaction of the audience. What you'll notice is when a story begins, people will sit up, they'll look at you all of a sudden and become engaged, maybe even lean forward in ways that they don't necessarily when you're just expositing the text. We don't want to necessarily take advantage of that for manipulative purposes, but it is valuable to tell an illustration or use an illustration to kind of engage a different side of people's minds. And of course, illustrations can help people apply the text. If we're talking about prayer and you know a person who was faithful in prayer and then saw God move in a powerful way, with their permission, sharing that story can help people understand how did this person apply this concept and what impact did it have in their life. So again, it can illuminate the text, it can validate the text, create breathing space and engagement, and help people apply the text. So then where do we find good illustrations? This is probably one of the hardest aspects of preparing a sermon. Where do I actually go? Let me offer just a few ideas for you. One, you can go to the Bible. So if you are in a New Testament text about faith, like Hebrews 11, you might do what the writer of Hebrews did, which is use Old Testament saints like Abraham or David or whoever as illustrations of faith. The Bible has a great number of wonderful stories that are true as well, that give us great illustrations of principles that are good as well as bad, right? The consequences of sin, the beauty of faith, the benefits of faith, and all of that. So the Bible can be a great source of illustrations. You can also go to your own life, especially where your life overlaps with your audience's life. So one of the things to think through with whatever audience you're talking to, what do I have in common with the people in this room? So if you're talking to a college-age audience, for example, what do I have in common with them? I've been to college, so I understand what it is like to study, to have a deadline, to be graded for my work. I'm currently in an educational program as well, and so I'm living that to some degree, that idea of like reading a lot and having to work hard. So I've got that in common. I've been in that place, like a lot of college students are, of wondering who I'm going to marry, wondering if I'll find a date, right? So think of those commonalities. With college students, you probably wouldn't want to use a ton of illustrations about your kids. You may use some, but they're going to have a harder time directly connecting to that. With a millennial audience or a Generation X audience, those types of illustrations are going to connect more directly. So illustrations from your own life that are going to most directly connect. It's even better if you can find illustrations that connect with everybody. Being stuck in traffic, for example, or having to pay your taxes. Things along those lines that everybody will relate to are going to be the best types of personal illustrations. So your own life. The news, again, news stories can be validating. They can be illuminative for the text, illuminating. Nature. So Jesus used nature a lot. He talked about birds, and he talked about flowers, and he talked about seeds in the ground. Jesus, of course, living in a more agrarian society, could use a lot more natural illustrations, and people would understand. But we still can use illustrations from nature. I've used illustrations about predators in the ocean, like a shark eating a fish, and how that relates to the concept maybe of sin or something along those lines. So nature can be great. Statistics can be great if they help validate the point you're trying to make. If you're talking about community, some statistics about loneliness in our society can be helpful. Just be aware that not all statistics you find are going to be accurate. And so I would encourage you, if you're reading a news article that cites some statistics, always go try to find the original source for those statistics and dig a little deeper so you don't misrepresent what those statistics are actually saying. But statistics can be useful. Google can be useful if you're looking for a particular type of illustration. Type it into Google and then just see what you find. Historical illustrations, I've used illustrations about well-known people from history, whether it's Abraham Lincoln or Genghis Khan or whoever, somebody that people will have heard of that illustrates the point that you're trying to make. So one of the things I tell people is if you want to be really good at illustrations, learn to become a reader of history, both ancient history and modern history, even a reader of fiction, because also fictional stories can be great for illustrations. Popular culture within reason, TV, movies, novels, all of that. Just be aware, if I use a pop cultural reference from 1987, a lot of my audience isn't going to understand it or know it unless I explain it. If I use a pop cultural reference from 2023, 2024, a lot of my audience isn't going to know it. So don't assume that everybody in your audience has watched a particular movie or TV show. Also be really careful, and we'll talk about this, with which movies and TV shows you refer to, and especially which ones you show clips from. Quotations from famous individuals that might help validate your text. Your own imagination. It's okay to make up an illustration or a story as long as you're clear this isn't a real story. So sometimes I'll say, like, imagine that you and I are in the car together and such happens. So people know that this isn't something that actually happened to me. Don't ever just make something up and tell a lie from the stage, but you can use your imagination in order to help prompt people to think in a different way about the text. So illustrations are everywhere. So just constantly be on the hunt. For me, I'm always looking for illustrations. Sometimes I will write them down. I know people who have a file where they write down any illustrations they find, but just always keep your eyes and your mind open as you look for illustrations. Let me just give a few cautions as well when it comes to illustrations about things not to do. First of all, don't tell any stories about other people without their permission. Even if you think it's a positive story that's going to cast them in a good light, don't tell stories about other people without permission, especially if those other people are in your family. Pastors sometimes have a bad reputation for using our kids or our spouses for sermon illustrations in ways that might embarrass them or shine an unwanted spotlight on them. So just ask permission. Most people are going to generally be thrilled to let you use them as a sermon illustration. But especially with our kids, sometimes when they hit a certain age, they're going to go, I'd rather not. I'd rather stay incognito. So always ask permission. Don't ever tell an illustration that would embarrass or demean another person, whether you ask permission or not. Don't ever put another person in a situation from the front of the room where they would be, their reputation is going to be tainted. Even if that person is far away and you think they're never going to hear it, I could tell you stories of people who have told negative illustrations about folks they thought would never learn about that illustration. And the person whose name was dragged through the mud learned about it, surprisingly. So don't ever tell any illustrations that would embarrass or demean. Crude humor. Avoid humor about bathroom functions or anything sexual, especially. Things that we would not feel comfortable joking about with our mom or even perhaps more importantly in the presence of Jesus. Don't do it in a sermon from the stage when you're preaching the Word of God. So crude humor, even if you think it's not that bad, the odds are that somebody in the room will be offended by it. So avoid crude humor. Real narrowly focused references, again, pop culture that only a few people are going to know or only a particular age group is going to know. Just be real careful about that. I tend to avoid canned jokes and illustrations that I find on the internet, whether those come from sermon illustration websites or whatever it may be, because they've just been redone and rehashed so many times. And quite often, they're just not really tailor-made for the audience that I'm speaking to. You might find a good illustration on a sermon illustration website, but I find that to be very, very rare. Like in my years of preaching, I could probably count on one hand the number of sermon illustrations I found on a website like that has really worked for my text and my audience. The other thing is that often they have questionable stories that are presented as true without any really validation or sources for them. So you can end up telling a story about whether it's Abraham Lincoln or Ronald Reagan or whatever that just isn't true if you find it on the internet. So be real careful about that. I avoid long videos or long audio clips because I think they tend to distract from the message and kind of pull people out of the message. Often I find if I'm going to use a video clip, use a really short one, less than 30 seconds, that quickly helps make my point, and then I move on. Even better, if you can just describe the video clip in vivid terms where people will get it, that's even better. Avoid making yourself the hero of every story. Let me tell you how generous I am. Let me tell you how much I pray. Let me tell you how well I responded to this tough situation. Avoid making yourself look good in every story and making every story about you and how spiritual you are. That will actually undermine your credibility in the long run with your audience. And then lastly, be real careful about over-disclosure. On the other end of making yourself a hero would be sharing your deepest, darkest sins from the front of the room. I would encourage you, if you're a preacher or a pastor, have close friends that will pray for you, with whom you can share the sin struggles that you have and the deepest struggles of your heart. But from the front of the room, in front of a congregation, is not usually the time to share those types of challenges and struggles. You want to be authentic. You want to be honest. You want to be truthful. But remember that if you're speaking even to 50 people, not all of those people in that room are your best friend or your accountability partner or your mentor. You are there to help guide and lead them toward Jesus, and you don't want to do things that are going to cause them to feel more uncomfortable than edified. And so over-disclosure is something just to be aware of, and that's a fine line between authenticity and over-disclosure, but just be aware that that line does exist. So there you go. There's some places to find illustrations. There's some things to watch out for. Let me encourage you to do this as an exercise. So for Philippians chapter 2, 1 through 4, go brainstorm 5 good illustrations from different sources that would help you preach that passage. And as you're walking through this course as well, if you're working on another message that you are updating in light of this course, go brainstorm at least 4 or 5 good illustrations for that message that will help clarify or validate your text or help people apply the text. We'll see you in the next lesson.